Good morning and welcome to ASEAN Kita. I'm Amro Aiman. This is a show where we explore the stories and the challenges and also the opportunities that lies within the region. So today we unpack President Xi Jinping's three-nation swing through Vietnam, Malaysia and Cambodia and ask what really lies beyond the handshakes. Did the tour rewrite trade routes, shift security balances, or simply add new photos to Beijing's scrapbook? Joining me in the studio is Daniel Rahman, Chief Executive Officer of the Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute, ASLI. Daniel, great to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Amiro.
Okay, so the first question is, Washington is dangling a hefty 46% duty over Vietnamese exports. If Hanoi leans closer to Beijing after Xi's visit, do you think that makes it more likely or less that the US will actually pull that tariff trigger, Daniel?
Right. Let's start by looking at the purpose of the friendship visits, right? These were planned even before the tariff announcements. So this has been an effort by Xi Jinping, who had just completed his key, you could say, legislative political sitting in China. And this was now his opportunity to travel Southeast Asia to build up friendship ties and trade politically, economically and socially. That's the first. The second premise that we're discussing this is also the uncertainty of which the Donald Trump US administration seems to be existing within, right? What happens, so you have tariffs today, exemptions tomorrow, and pauses the day after. So in other words, there's a lot of uncertainty. Now, to answer your question, the answer really depends because of these uncertainties. As we know, Vietnam is America's largest importer, largest exporter, so they export the most to the US, whereas they're China's largest importer. And the reason why this scenario exists is because there is a lot of trade between the US and a lot of demand coming from the US side. So whatever Vietnam exports to the US is because there's demand for businesses within the US, small businesses and the likes. Now, we understand that Trump calls it reciprocal tariffs on the basis that there may have been some, you could say, backdoor maneuvering of non-tariff barriers or avoidance of tariffs by the Vietnam side by bringing in Chinese goods. But fundamentally, let's remember this, it is a war, a trade war between the US and China. And in this regard, Vietnam could be seen as collateral, like most other countries around the world. But the key point here is America also has to understand that Vietnam is a supportive country towards it. And not just trade, but it also has other things we can talk about, such as security, such as cultural ties, historical ties. We understand what has happened in the past. And therefore, the US in itself has to also tread carefully in how it treats these tariffs. Because if detrimental consequences face Vietnam, which likely it will because of the tariffs, it will also impact the US economy.
But will Beijing use this moment to press Hanoi for a deeper yuan settlement or maybe infrastructure deals? Perhaps?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if these were part of the conversations. I mean, Vietnam and Hanoi, or Hanoi and China, have strong ties within infrastructure, such as railways, such as development, and these are needs for Vietnam, which is also a rapidly developing country, a young population, and growing industry. So it would be, you know, almost China recognizes these opportunities and hence the overtures towards Hanoi and Vietnam. And this is something that the US also should not take its eye off. So there's a bigger picture at play, not just the hard infrastructure, rail, etc., but also winning the hearts and minds of the people, which is very important.
Some observers say the region is quietly banding together as an economic non-alignment club, hoping to buffer against both US tariffs and also Europe's carbon taxes. Do you see real momentum behind that idea, or is it just a wishful thinking for the region?
That's a good question. I think if we look at ASEAN, while we have the ASEAN Economic Community, countries has always approached trade and economics on an independent basis because of sovereignty and because ASEAN doesn't intervene, but with a view towards ASEAN centrality as a core foundation. I know it's a bit of a fun, it's like saying yes and no at the same time. But let's look at some examples, right? We have the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement, right? There is also RCEP, there's also the CPTPP. Once upon a time, US was part of it, now no longer. Some ASEAN countries are in both of the agreements, some of them are only in one. At the same time, you see countries approaching it with very differentiated approaches. Malaysia, for example, has applied to join BRICS. Indonesia is a BRICS member. Philippines will not be keen on joining BRICS for historical and, I suppose, lack of real economic upsides for it. whereas you see Singapore applying to join the OECD. So different countries will have different approaches to how it wants to align its sort of economic situation, and that also depends on local circumstances. Like Malaysia, we're very much an open and trading nation. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has welcomed investments from the US, notwithstanding the challenging geopolitical situation, and we've seen companies like, well, of course, Tesla, Oracle, Microsoft, Google, all coming in and wanting to invest from data centers and beyond. So to say that there's a non-alignment club, probably not entirely precise, but there's always been a balance between ASEAN centrality and economic independence in the global market.
But if there is so a non-alignment club, would a formal non-alignment club would scare off the Western FDI or reassure it instead? Yeah.
I don't think there will ever be a formal non-alignment club. It's one of those things which is in practice but never said, right? It's things that you think about. But in terms of whether they scare it or not, also I don't think so, because we can see the fundamental aspect of investments are return of investments. European investors looking at the challenging tariff situations, looking at how the world, at least the US, wants to approach it as a unipolar power as opposed to a multipolar power, will still look to ASEAN and Southeast Asia as a place for growth, right? Relatively young population, hungry. The World Bank projects anywhere between 3 to 5% economic growth for the next decade. So it's an exciting place to be. And I don't think having a non-aligned position necessarily changes any of that. Of course, the EU at the sort of formal governmental governance level come in as a bloc, and we don't. That could be a potential challenge for us, because you have, for example, the CBAM, and that would see an increase in, you call it green tariffs of imports from Southeast Asia going to Europe. So for something like this, I would probably argue ASEAN needs to have some kind of collective position so that there can be better negotiations and better agreements with the European side. And just to add very quickly, we've seen that when ASEAN countries tried to go in alone, like when Vietnam tried to say zero tariffs to the US, what happened? Donald Trump immediately rejected it. And that was quite a hard position for them to take. Now, if ASEAN had gone in as a bloc, we could have seen a better bargaining positioning and greater strength from the get-go.
Daniel, the South China Sea has been a long-standing issue within the region and China itself. Xi's tour projected a lot of goodwill, but in practical terms, did that make it easier for ASEAN to hash out a binding code of conduct, or has Beijing just added leverage to its negotiating hand?
Well, this is where real politics comes in. We've seen the Code of Conduct, the COC, having been discussed for almost 13 years now, right? Since 2002 when it had its original declaration. We are, I would say, not to say nowhere close to it, but clearly there's still a lot of jostling. What this visit has done is, of course, it's made the situation more polite because the countries are now engaging. And there were mentions about especially, for example, the joint statement with Malaysia and China, to recognize that the COC is something that's very important in balancing territorial sovereignty, exclusive economic gain, etc., etc. Now, Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim has come up very firmly and said that Petronas will continue to explore various mineral extraction and exploration within what we deem as our exclusive economic zone, right? Now, we have to understand that there is within ASEAN a schism. You've got countries which will raise the dispute, Malaysia, Vietnam, and I believe Philippines, right? But you also have countries which take a more neutral position, such as Laos and Cambodia. So in that sense, it will be tough for there to be an ASEAN consensus, but having the COC at the agenda table, as part of the agenda, will always ensure that conversations happen. Now, it's been a bit tricky because China has increased sort of its aggression, right? Especially as we've seen shooting of lasers and water towards Filipino fishermen. And that's not been taken very kindly, and the Philippines is exploring legal options, whether through WTO, ICJ, etc., etc. And that will complicate the situation in times to come. But I think having the COC in place still allows for some kind of negotiations. But we always know, right, with China, it does get a little bit tricky, especially when it comes to territory and maintaining sovereignty.
But can we realistically expect the signed COC before Malaysia hands the chair to Myanmar in 2026, do you think?
I think you know the answer to that. It's most likely not. Well, what we see is negotiations are still happening. As of mid-2025, there is a second reading of the COC draft. And China prefers a non-binding code, whereas countries like the Philippines prefer some kind of enforcement mechanism. And that is something that I think will lead to a deadlock that will not be agreed upon. So for China, they look at it as a gentleman's agreement, right? Trust my word, trust the fact that we've got relationships, cultural, economic, social, whereas other countries are saying, I don't quite trust you in that sense, like I can appreciate it, but let's have something that if in case your commitments are not adhered to, we can enforce.
Now, Cambodia hosts Chinese warships and Vietnam holds drills with the US and Malaysia orders French submarines. Is that diversity our collective strength, showing true strategic autonomy, or a liability that could pull ASEAN in different direction during a crisis, Daniel?
Well, I think it's quite theoretical, right, this question, because if we talk about the situation of a crisis, well, fortunately, thanks to the adherence to rule-based order, I mean, China and US in our statement as well, China and Malaysia and the other countries it's been to have affirmed commitment to the United Nations Charter, to various trade organizations. We also have platforms of engagement like the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting, the ARFs, the regional forums, and the meeting of experts and eminence persons. So there are multiple platforms of engagement. Now, it is not uncommon for countries to have a differentiated strategic security approach. EU, for example, does not have a unified EU policy, right? They've tried to push for an Indo-Pacific policy, but different countries in EU tend to have their own approach to how they treat Southeast Asia. Now, we see, for example, and it's also dependent on the history of the ASEAN countries. So Malaysia, as you said, has got the French submarines, but also some American, and we're looking at Russian military equipment. Vietnam has got does exercises with the United States and Japan for war games and such, and Cambodia has Chinese warships at their Ream naval base. Quite recently, the Philippines has expanded one of their key strategic defense agreements with the US, which I think will increase the number of bases from approximately 4 to, I believe, something like 8 or 9. And because also we understand that the Philippines and the US have a shared security history in that regard. So, you know, I'll put it this way. We hope we'll never get to a situation where there is a threat to the security, safety of Southeast Asia and its nations. I would like to think that ASEAN's existence and these platforms ensures that there will always be continuous dialogue. China historically has always been very refrained from aggressions. The US, on the other hand, has a little bit more history of very different foreign policy, if we could put it that way. Not saying that necessarily anything will happen. But of course, I think if you talk about a potential flashpoint, that's most likely Taiwan and not yet the Southeast Asian region.
But when it comes to defense budget, could tighter US financing push countries toward Chinese or European hardware instead?
Well, that's an interesting question, because in the US, finance budget, if I'm not mistaken, is between 3 to 6% of their GDP, which is massive. It is one of the few American centrally coordinated development strategies, i.e. as some people may say, the military-industrial complex. Now, whether the tightening of budget, well, as you know, Trump is saying that make Europe pay for the security, make Southeast Asia pay for the security. Basically, they don't want to be paying for anybody else's security. That's a tricky question, whereas China has always been very moderate in how they've expanded on their security spending. Of course, let's be very clear, the US has got a huge advantage because of many, many years of investment. Now, whether that might push ASEAN countries, I think that really depends. We've seen Japan, for example, move away from their constitutional pledge of a purely defense force post-World War II to today, which is one that also has potential attack capabilities, right? And that's not just in response to China. No, it's more what's happening in North Korea, right? And they have to build up those capacities. Now, a US reduction in spending could mean countries rethink their spending in security. I think some countries have indicated that, but I really hope that doesn't happen. Because what we see is security spending will remove other more important needs within Southeast Asia, which is development, trade, education, welfare, and I don't think anybody has a space for it. Now, yes, if US reduces their spending, it doesn't mean we have to spend more. It just means we have to invest more in peace, in dialogue, in engagement. And that's why entities like ASEAN become even more important in times to come.
Well, there's still a lot to unpack on President Xi Jinping's visit to ASEAN with Daniel Rahman, Chief Executive Officer of Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute of ASLI. But we'll take a short break and we'll be right back after this. Welcome back. You're still watching ASEAN Kita. I'm Amir Rahman. Joining us is our guest, Dr. Sri Ganesh, Secretary of the Malaysian Tourism Federation. So we're still unpacking on how can we reimagine ASEAN as one destination in its tourism attraction. Doctor, let's pick up where we left off. We often focus on capital cities, but tourism growth also depends on smaller destinations. In your view, which second tier or maybe perhaps lesser known ASEAN cities have a strong potential? What's needed to bring them to life? Maybe better flights, marketing, or perhaps infrastructure, Doctor?
Yeah, actually, if you ask lesser known ASEAN cities, we can look like in Malaysia, we can see Sarawak, okay? Laos, Luang Prabang, Philippines, what they call it, Iloilo, something like that. You see, are rich actually in culture, cuisine, and eco attractions. Yeah, so but the threat is poor connectivity. Okay, they have nice destination, but poor connectivity and lack of coordinated marketing. Means the marketing between the ASEAN countries or even in their own country is very lack of marketing. So without regional air access policies and investments in the second tier airports, these gems will remain hidden from the global travelers' radar. So that's why ASEAN, if the tourists come from EU, example, comes to Singapore, and from Singapore, they need to have a good connectivity, flight connectivity to those second tier areas. You see? Yeah, so if they have too many connectivity, then it will make the tourists feel tired. Oh, I need to go to KL, then from KL I need to go to Sarawak. You know, then from Sarawak another flight into there. So this is something will make them feel tired. But if they have a longer period of time to be in ASEAN countries, then they would have the connectivity should be discussed between the ASEAN countries from where to where and where to where. So this will actually give more opportunities to it.
And many local tourism players like homestays, cafes and guides miss out on regional tourism campaigns. How can ASEAN governments help include them more directly in promotional efforts, Doctor? What is needed to ensure they benefit alongside big brands and hotel chains?
Yeah, actually the real risk is leaving SMEs behind. Currently, major players dominate regional exposure due to the funding and digital capabilities. Okay, they have good funding, they have good digital capabilities. So ASEAN actually needs a digital tourism marketplace, okay, that aggregates and promotes local experience actually. This is what we need first. Without this inclusivity, regional tourism growth will be top-heavy and unsustainable, leading to income inequality and community disengagement. Yeah, so this is what we need to look into. So how we promote them and how the SMEs can actually have a place to promote their products, and whatever they promote reach the tourists of the ASEAN community.
And Doctor, I would like to bring this discussion also to budget hotel sector across ASEAN, because we know when it comes to tourism, when it comes to tourists, they often pick budget hotel because it's much cheaper and it's much more reliable. And if you can see operating costs very sharply between budget hotels in Hanoi and Jakarta and Manila, for example, because of local utility rates and also taxes. Maybe perhaps you could suggest what single regional policy could best narrow that cost gap and perhaps level the playing field across ASEAN, Doctor?
Yeah, if it comes to budget hotels, the governments should actually sit down and come with a better policy to ensure the sustainability of the budget hotels. That is something very important, that all the government in the ASEAN countries should sit down and come out with a proper policy. The issue now is the threats of the industry of the budget hotels. So that will increase their operational costs, hence make them to sell at a more higher price. So the tourists who comes to ASEAN, which wants to sit or stay in a cheaper rate hotel, and they can, be in the ASEAN region for a longer period, they wouldn't stay in higher range hotel. They will prefer a lower rate hotel, but they can stay for a longer period. You see, so we should cater all segments of tourists. So when they stay in budget hotels, they need a good price. But the issue is facing the budget hotels segment or in all the ASEAN countries is the threats of the industry and unlevel playing field. So when you said level playing field, actually is because of the unlevel playing field, whereby we still allow the countries still don't regulate short-term rental accommodations, OTA issues, so what are the difference of operational costs for a budget hotel and a higher rate hotel? So when a budget hotel, they needs to have a lower operational cost to give back a very affordable cost to the tourists who comes to their country.
And when you mention rivals and competition, we often see competition from homestays and also Airbnb is eating into budget hotel market share. What incentives or collaboration that could turn these segments into partners than rivals, Doctor?
Okay, it's just about regulations. We are licensed accommodation providers, and they are unlicensed accommodation providers. So we just want them to be regulated by a law and to ensure that everything they do follow is a fair level playing field for both parties. Okay, so they cannot, they need to follow certain regulations to enable them to ensure that property they do to be sold as a tourist accommodation. We don't want to have a tourist staying in a unit, short-term rental accommodation unit, STRA unit, and having a fight with a neighbor. You see, because the neighbor are the owners of the property, and they are just tourists staying as a neighbor, and tomorrow they go and a new person comes in. So this kind of regulation should be done, should have. So if there are these kinds of issues arose, then that particular country will be digital world, people will start spreading reviews, and instead of, it's because of this STRA, it will affect the budget hotel or the hotel industries at a whole.
And Doctor, when we mentioned about budget hotels, workforce mobility is a challenge. Budget hotels rely on multitasking staff who frequently leave the industries. Malaysia, as a chair of ASEAN this year, what could we do to ensure this problem or to fill the shortages of hospitality skills in the country, that we can lead the other countries in ASEAN as well to ensure this problem is not damaging the budget hotel industry across the region, Doctor?
Yeah, actually, there are some good countries where we can see they have very good hospitality skills. Okay, so every of the ASEAN countries should discuss. They have their universities, they have their educational colleges in every countries. So should be discussed to get these students from any of the ASEAN countries, and they should be able to work in any of the ASEAN countries. You see? So they should share the workforce and skills between the ASEAN countries. And we also could to exchange culture and train them about our example coming to Malaysia to work. So they will learn the Malaysian culture. And when they go to Thailand, they will learn the Thailand culture, But end up is just one, it's about hospitality.
And you mentioned before that ratings are often shared by the tourists. Should ASEAN introduce a dedicated a rating system of a budget hotel classification with realistic criteria, cleanliness, safety, and basic digital amenities tailored for smaller properties, Doctor, to make sure it's easier for tourists to compare and contrast which hotels or accommodation they would like to stay in?
Yeah, actually, we have ASEAN standards. Hotels, it's just about ASEAN standards. Even a budget hotel as long they fulfill the standards of cleanliness, of services provided, of digitalization, it's just same. The tourists will understand that. So it's about the operator to learn the standards and follow the standards with the guidance of each country's ministries and agencies, and including associations, you see.
And Dr. Malaysia which is chairing ASEAN in 2025. If there's one tourism initiative you think we should lead to push the ASEAN as a one destination agenda, what would it be and why would it matter most right now?
Yeah, Malaysia actually should push for a ASEAN travel pass. Okay, as the chair, they should push for ASEAN travel pass, a unified digital platform offering visa facilitation, regional travel packages, and local offering listing. You see, it must actually be inclusive of the SMEs, especially the SMEs. So this single move actually can bridge policy gaps, enhance connectivity, and democratize access to regional tourism benefits. If we fail to act now, ASEAN may lose its tourism edge and more integrated regions. So we hope that Malaysia, as the chair for ASEAN 2025, to work hard and take action, and don't wait for the next chair to move, and another 10 years we will be chairing it with the same agenda again.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today's episode of ASEAN Kita. We would like to thank Dr. Sri Ganesh, Secretary General of the Malaysian Tourism Federation, for his insights. I guess that's all the time that we have for today's episode. I'm Amir Rahman. Thank you for watching. Until next time, take care and see you again on ASEAN Kita.